Winter, 1944. Somewhere in the heart of Texas, the air smells of pine and distant smoke. A long line of German prisoners steps off a train, boots crunching against gravel, eyes squinting at the open horizon. They expect the cold cruelty of captivity. Instead, they find something they never imagined, a small town waving politely from across the wire. The guards don't shout. They hand out coffee. Hot coffee? One American soldier lights a cigarette for a captured man whose hands still tremble from the front. The camp is clean, orderly, and oddly quiet, not the vision of a decadent, collapsing democracy they had been taught to despise, for men raised on Nazi propaganda. This was not just America. It was confusion made real. Here, their enemy offered them books, baseball, and bread fresh from the oven, and as the days turned into months, these soldiers would begin to see something far more disarming than military might. They would see freedom from the inside of a fence. By 1943, the tides of war had begun to turn. The Allied armies were advancing across North Africa, and tens of thousands of German soldiers, once part of Rommel's proud Afrika Korps, found themselves surrounded. Outnumbered and forced to surrender, the British faced a problem. Their prison camps were overcrowded, and the constant bombing campaigns across Britain made housing large numbers of prisoners dangerous and logistically impossible. The United States, with its vast land and industrial capacity, offered the solution. Under agreements within the Geneva Convention and Allied coordination, the U.S. began to receive shiploads of German prisoners, not to punish them, but to contain them safely and use their labor to fill wartime shortages. By the end of the war, over 425,000 German POWs would be held across more than 700 camps scattered throughout the United States. They were sent everywhere, from the deserts of Arizona to the pine forests of Maine. The largest numbers were found in Texas, Oklahoma, and the Midwest, regions far from any coast, where escape would be nearly impossible. The first to arrive were veterans hardened by the North African desert, men who had fought for the Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, disciplined, proud, and convinced of German superiority. They had seen the chaos of war and expected revenge from their captors. Instead, they were greeted by calm organization, efficient transportation, and orderly camp systems that followed Geneva rules almost to the letter. The American authorities saw these men not as monsters, but as soldiers who had served their country, misguided perhaps, but deserving of dignity. Life in the camps began with routine registration, delousing, medical checks, and assignment to barracks. Each man received clothing, food, and even pay, 40 cents a day in canteen coupons. The guards were often young Americans, many barely out of school, who treated the prisoners with a mix of curiosity and caution. As they settled into their new surroundings, the German soldiers began to see things that didn't align with their training or propaganda. The America they had been warned about, a land of chaos, corruption, and racial mixing, looked nothing like this. They saw efficient farms, clean kitchens, and local civilians who lived comfortably, even during wartime. What struck many most deeply was the abundance. While Germany was starving under Allied bombings, these prisoners were served meat, vegetables, and even desserts. Newspapers later reported astonishment among captured officers who said, "We ate better as prisoners than our families did back home." For American farmers and small-town citizens, the arrival of these POWs was surreal. Few had ever met a German, and now hundreds were living behind fences just miles away. They came to fill labor shortages in agriculture, forestry, and construction, often working shoulder to shoulder with locals under supervision. At first, there was fear. Rumors spread that these men were hardened Nazis or saboteurs. But soon, as weeks passed, American towns began to see another side. Young men who missed their homes, who sang songs quietly in the evenings, who built model ships and painted murals on barrack walls. The paradox was clear. America, even in war, chose to fight brutality with civilization. Inside those fences, A strange kind of peace was growing, one that neither the prisoners nor their captors fully understood yet, and as German officers reported back to the Reich about the humane treatment they received, Hitler's propaganda machine went silent on the subject, terrified that soldiers at the front might surrender too willingly. For the Germans, captivity in America would become a mirror, showing them what their enemy truly was, a free society confident enough to show mercy. By 1944, the German POW system in the United States had grown into a quiet empire of fences and barracks. From Oregon's lumber yards to Alabama's cotton fields, these camps became small, self-contained worlds, microcosms of German society. Rebuilt behind barbed wire, each camp was run with near-military precision. Prisoners rose at dawn, stood for roll call, and were assigned to work crews. They built roads, harvested crops, and repaired railways, all tasks permitted under the Geneva Convention. In return, they earned canteen credit, which they could spend on cigarettes, soap, or small luxuries, but the camps weren't just places of confinement. They became unexpected centers of transformation. American officers, guided by War Department policy, encouraged education among the prisoners. Many camps offered classes in English, history, economics, and even democratic governance. The goal was subtle: to expose German soldiers to a way of thinking entirely different from the rigid totalitarianism they had been raised in. Some resisted. Among the hardcore Nazi loyalists, known as Die Schwarzen, discipline remained severe, and any sign of cooperation with the Americans was branded as betrayal. These loyalists tried to maintain the same hierarchy they had known in the Wehrmacht, but for many others, especially younger soldiers, the experience of life in America began to crack the ideological armor they had worn for years. They read American newspapers. They saw guards and officers who treated them humanely. They heard debates on the radio, open disagreements without punishment. For men who had lived under the shadow of Gestapo control, this was a revelation. They began to ask quiet questions among themselves. How could a country that showed such decency and freedom be the same decadent democracy their propaganda had described? In several camps, German educators, often anti-Nazi intellectuals or captured officers skeptical of Hitler, began informal lectures. Topics ranged from world literature to political philosophy. One camp in Texas became famous for its internal camp university, where prisoners held discussions on democracy, ethics, and international law. At Camp Swift, a captured lieutenant later recalled, "We debated freedom of speech. The Americans allowed us to argue, even against them. That would never have been possible in Germany." Meanwhile, cultural activities thrived. The prisoners organized orchestras, staged plays, and even published handwritten newspapers. Within the confines of barbed wire, they recreated a semblance of society, but one influenced by the tolerance and structure they observed in their captors outside the fences. The American public slowly began to soften. At first, civilians had been suspicious. Many had lost sons and brothers to the war. But as the German prisoners worked quietly in the fields and factories, their diligence began to change perceptions. Farmers often invited work crews to share lunch under the shade. Children watched with fascination as these once feared enemy soldiers carved toys or played soccer during breaks. The interaction was transformative on both sides. The Germans discovered that ordinary Americans were not driven by hatred or propaganda, and Americans, in turn, realized that these were not monsters, but men caught in the machinery of war, young, weary, and far from home. It was in these quiet exchanges that the true victory of democracy began to unfold, not through weapons, but through example. By 1945, the war in Europe was drawing to a close. Thousands of prisoners who had spent years in America now saw the world differently. They had seen the efficiency of a free society, the strength of diversity, and the quiet power of respect. They didn't yet know it. But many of these men would return to Germany carrying something far greater than survival, the seeds of a new national consciousness. The America they once mocked had changed them slowly. imperceptibly through exposure, not coercion, and as the guns of Europe fell silent in May 1945. These men faced a new question. What would they do with what they had learned behind the wire? For the German prisoners of war, America was not the punishment they expected. It was a mirror, one that reflected back their beliefs, stripped of propaganda and pretense. Inside this reflection, many began to question what they truly stood for. For men who had braced for brutality, the first surprise was simple: decency. They had been told that American soldiers were crude, materialistic, and cowardly, yet the guards they encountered treated them by the rules, often with a professionalism that bordered on respect. At Camp Carson, Colorado, German sergeants saluted their American counterparts out of habit and were startled when the salute was returned. The U.S. Army's philosophy was rooted in discipline, not hatred. One American officer wrote in a report, "They expected a conqueror's cruelty. We gave them order, food, and fairness. It unsettled them more than force ever could." To the Americans, these camps were an opportunity, not for revenge, but for proof. Proof that democracy could uphold its principles even toward its enemies. Every cigarette fairly traded, every letter home uncensored, every clean blanket, it was a statement of moral strength. For the prisoners, this was confusing. They had marched through Europe as soldiers of a master race, certain of their moral superiority. Now they were served by a nation of immigrants, men with names from every corner of the world, and yet that nation stood united, powerful, and free. It was the first quiet crack in the wall of ideology, yet, behind the fences, another battle raged. It wasn't fought with rifles, but with words, intimidation, and fear. Among the POWs, Nazi loyalists tried to keep control. They formed secret committees, enforced discipline, and punished dissent. Their aim was to maintain the same authoritarian structure they had lived under. Informers listened for defeatist talk. Prisoners who praised America or questioned the Reich risked violence. In some camps, those suspected of betrayal were beaten or even killed by fellow inmates before the Americans could intervene. These internal power struggles revealed the depth of Nazi indoctrination. Even in captivity, far from the front lines, the ideology of fear persisted. It wasn't imposed by guards now. It came from within, but the American command understood something crucial. Time and exposure could erode fanaticism better than punishment. So they separated the camps. The hardliners, the blacks, were isolated from moderates and grays who were more open to change. In these quieter environments, education programs flourished. In places like Camp Algona, Iowa, prisoners studied literature, civics, and economics under American tutors. The idea wasn't to convert them, it was to show them that there was another way to think. A sergeant later recalled, "They didn't try to humiliate us. They showed us how they lived, and it made us wonder why we fought them outside the fences." Rural America began to see the prisoners not as enemies, but as workers and men. In Nebraska and Texas, farmers who had lost sons to the war watched German soldiers repair barns, plow fields, and pick fruit. These prisoners were strong, disciplined, and surprisingly polite. Sometimes bonds formed, unspoken but real. A farmer in Georgia remembered giving a German prisoner a sandwich on a hot afternoon. The man hesitated, saluted, and said softly, "Danke." That simple moment, bread shared between enemies, echoed across thousands of small interactions nationwide. Many Americans realized that these weren't faceless villains. They were young men who had been led astray by lies. And for the Germans, the experience shattered decades of propaganda. They saw black and white soldiers working together. They saw women managing farms, businesses, and offices. They saw freedom in action, not chaos, but cooperation. This quiet cultural exchange did more than any propaganda broadcast ever could. It humanized the enemy. By 1945, thousands of prisoners had begun to drift away from the ideology that had once defined them. In camp newspapers, prisoners published editorials debating democracy, ethics, and responsibility. One German corporal wrote in his camp journal, "Perhaps we were not the master race, Perhaps mastery is not what the world needs. Letters home described American life with fascination. Some spoke of the clean streets, the generosity of strangers, the abundance of food, things unimaginable in war-torn Europe. The War Department noticed. Quietly, it began encouraging re-education. The goal was to prepare these men to return to Germany not as enemies, but as witnesses of a different truth. Not all were ready. Many still believed in the Reich, clinging to pride as a shield against defeat. But for countless others, America had become a teacher. They entered captivity as soldiers. They would leave it as observers of freedom, some even as believers. Inside those fences, the seeds of Germany's future democracy were planted not through slogans, but through experience. And soon, as Germany lay in ruins, those same men would be sent home to a land unrecognizable, and a mission they hadn't expected. By 1945, thousands of prisoners had begun to drift away from the ideology that had once defined them. In camp newspapers, prisoners published editorials debating democracy, ethics, and responsibility. One German corporal wrote in his camp journal, "Perhaps we were not the master race. Perhaps mastery is not what the world needs." Letters home described American life with fascination. Some spoke of the clean streets, the generosity of strangers, the abundance of food, things unimaginable in war-torn Europe. The War Department noticed. Quietly, it began encouraging re-education. The goal was to prepare these men to return to Germany not as enemies, but as witnesses of a different truth. Not all were ready. Many still believed in the Reich, clinging to pride as a shield against defeat. But for countless others, America had become a teacher. They entered captivity as soldiers. They would leave it as observers of freedom, some even as believers. Inside those fences, the seeds of Germany's future democracy were planted not through slogans, but through experience. And soon, as Germany lay in ruins, those same men would be sent home to a land unrecognizable and a mission they hadn't expected. The battle for Europe had been fought with tanks and artillery, but in America's prisoner of war camps, a different kind of battle unfolded, one fought with patience, education, and moral consistency. Where the front lines had demanded destruction, these camps demanded understanding. For the U.S. Army, every captured German soldier represented not just a surrender, but an opportunity before the war ended. Intelligence officers quickly realized that Germany's soldiers were a treasure trove of information. Captured officers, engineers, and radio operators provided insight into the Wehrmacht's organization, technology, and even morale. The U.S. Army created specialized interrogation centers. Fort Hunt in Virginia, known under the secret designation P.O. Box 1142, became one of the most important there. Intelligence specialists, many of them German-speaking Jewish refugees, conducted interrogations that relied on empathy rather than torture. They offered cigarettes, coffee, and humane treatment. In return, they often received critical intelligence, U-boat positions, be to rocket production details or troop dispositions. One interrogator later recalled, "When you treat a man like a human being, he tells you more than any beating ever could." This strategy produced immense results. Information gained from German POWs helped shorten the war in Europe and reduced casualties in the Atlantic. But beyond the tactical gain, it proved a powerful moral point that democracy could win even in silence. Behind this humane treatment was deliberate leadership. The American military command, guided by the Geneva Convention and Washington's moral directives, made it clear Germany's prisoners would be treated fairly, no matter what the Nazis had done in Europe. For men like General Alan Gullion, head of the Army's Provost Marshal General's office, it wasn't about kindness. It was about discipline and national image. He famously said, "We will not become what we are fighting." That decision, though controversial to some Americans who had lost family in the war, laid the groundwork for something extraordinary. Respect from the defeated. German officers observed how efficiently the American system operated. They saw guards who obeyed orders without brutality, officers who commanded with authority but without fear. For the first time, many realized that discipline, did not require terror, it required integrity. This subtle demonstration of democracy in uniform became the most effective re-education program of all. The psychological transformation among German prisoners wasn't immediate. It unfolded in stages: disbelief, confusion, reflection, and finally realization. At first, defeat felt temporary. The Reich's propaganda had promised miracle weapons and final victory. Many prisoners believed the war would soon turn, but then came the letters. Through the Red Cross, families in Germany began writing about bombed cities, lost homes, and starvation. The illusion crumbled. When prisoners compared stories, a collective understanding began to emerge. The war was truly lost, and the Reich had lied to them. For many, that revelation was shattering. A chaplain at Camp Swift, Texas, described it as a slow collapse of faith. Men who once worshipped the Fuhrer now sat in silence, staring at the camp fences, questioning everything they had believed. The U.S. military psychologists monitoring these changes understood that ideology could not be erased. It had to be replaced with reason. Thus began structured programs, English lessons, civic discussions, history readings, and even film screenings. The films showed liberated concentration camps, horrifying images that many Germans initially dismissed as propaganda. But repeated exposure, combined with letters from home, eventually forced acceptance. This was the true psychological warfare, not destruction. But re-education through truth, culture became one of America's quietest weapons. In several camps, the U.S. Army allowed controlled exposure to art, literature, and music. Prisoners organized orchestras, theater plays, and debate clubs. Instead of being censored, many of these activities were encouraged as long as they promoted free expression rather than propaganda. This cultural freedom was revolutionary to men raised under censorship. A former Luftwaffe lieutenant later wrote, "In America, we learned to disagree without fear. That was something new to us. Even small acts carried symbolic power, choosing what to read, what to perform, or what to write. These were acts of intellectual liberation, and doing years of totalitarian conditioning. For the Americans, it wasn't accidental. It was strategy, demonstrating that ideas, once freed, could defeat ideology, perhaps. The most striking transformation came when prisoners began to see America as a moral mirror, a reflection of what Germany could have been without Nazism. They saw racial segregation and criticized it. Yet even then, some noticed that Black American soldiers, though treated unjustly at home, still fought for a democratic ideal. One German prisoner in Alabama reportedly told a U.S. guard, "If a nation can fight for freedom while not fully living it, maybe there is hope for everyone." The irony wasn't lost on the Americans either. Many guards admitted that the war forced them to confront their own nation's contradictions. The camps became unexpected classrooms for both sides. In that quiet moral confrontation, empathy grew. Hatred faded. Humanity reasserted itself. By 1946, tens of thousands of German prisoners were ready to return home, not as Nazis, but as men who had lived democracy firsthand. The war had stripped them of illusions, but captivity had given them something new, understanding. Their next chapter would begin not behind barbed wire, but among the ruins of their homeland, a homeland they would soon help rebuild with lessons learned in the most unexpected of places, America. Spring 1945, the news traveled faster than the guards could contain it. In hundreds of POW camps across the United States, the word spread like wildfire. Hitler is dead. At first, disbelief. Men gathered around radios, eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. The voice on the broadcast was calm, almost indifferent. The Führer had fallen. Berlin was burning. The war that once consumed the world was finally over. But for those behind the barbed wire of America's prisoner of war camps, victory and defeat carried strange meanings. Some broke down in silence. Others refused to believe it, calling the news allied propaganda. But within days, confirmation arrived through newspapers, guards' murmurs, and official bulletins. The Reich was gone. The map of Europe was changing forever, the laughter, the arrogance, the certainty. All of it vanished overnight for thousands of German soldiers imprisoned in America. The fall of the Reich wasn't just a political event, it was an existential collapse. They had entered the war believing themselves invincible, heirs to centuries of military tradition. Now, they were stateless men, their flags destroyed, their leaders dead, their homeland occupied. One prisoner at Camp McCain, Mississippi, wrote in his diary, "I have no country. I have no uniform. I'm no one." In that moment, America's treatment of them took on an entirely new meaning. The camps that once felt like humiliation now felt like refuge. The food, the safety, even the work details, these were luxuries compared to the devastation their families now faced in Germany. News clippings from Europe began circulating through the camps, photographs of flattened cities, bombed railways, and desperate civilians scavenging for food. Prisoners stared at the images in stunned silence. A former Panzer commander whispered to a fellow inmate, "My family. There's nothing left to return to." It was the moment when captivity turned into gratitude, a bitter, haunting gratitude. In the days following Germany's surrender, U.S. camp officers initiated what they called Operation Reorientation. The program was simple yet profound: educate the prisoners, show them the truth, and prepare them for the world that would come next. Each camp received crates of photographs and films from Europe, evidence of concentration camps liberated by Allied forces. Prisoners were assembled in makeshift cinemas to watch. What they saw shattered them. Men who had served under the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, or the Kriegsmarine. Men who had sworn allegiance to the Reich wept openly. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted a picture of glory and righteousness. Now, on the flickering screens before them, they saw the unfiltered truth: emaciated survivors, piles of corpses, burned villages. A U.S. chaplain later wrote, "They did not blink. They watched every frame as if punishment demanded it." In that darkened hall, the illusion of noble war died. Letters from home began arriving by the hundreds. Some were written by wives, others by mothers or siblings. All carried the same tone: despair. "Hamburg is ashes. Father did not survive the winter. There is no bread, only water." The prisoners clutched these letters as if they were lifelines, the only connection to a broken homeland. In one Texas camp, a former SS sergeant quietly approached his American guard and asked for extra work hours. When asked why, he simply said, "To send money home. For my children." Even in captivity, humanity endured. The Americans, seeing the shift in morale, responded with compassion. They allowed prisoners to send Red Cross packages, to volunteer on nearby farms, and to earn small wages. This small gesture, the ability to help their families, restored a fragment of dignity. It was no longer a war between enemies. It was survival between men. As the months passed, something remarkable began to happen. The German POWs, once proud, defiant soldiers, began admiring the very society that had defeated them. They watched as American guards voted in local elections, debated politics, and read freely from newspapers without fear of punishment. They saw churches of all faiths, even Jewish congregations, operating openly and without violence. It was a quiet revelation: democracy not as a slogan, but as a lived experience. One prisoner later wrote in his memoir, "In Germany, we were told democracy was chaos. In America, I saw order born from freedom." The realization spread like a contagion of conscience. By the end of 1945, Camp Command reports noted a visible decline in militarism and an increased interest in democratic values. It wasn't propaganda, it was observation through fair treatment, education, and exposure to everyday freedom. The United States had done something extraordinary. It had transformed enemies into future allies. When the time came to send them home, many prisoners left with tears in their eyes. They had entered America as conquerors in chains. They departed as men who had glimpsed a better world. The barbed wire fences that once symbolized defeat had, in a strange way, become their teachers, silent guardians of a transformation no one had foreseen, and as they boarded the trains that would carry them to the ships bound for Europe, the American guards saluted them not as enemies, but as men. That was the day when captivity ended. But the real story of how these men reshaped post-war Germany was only beginning. Winter faded into the soft light of 1946 across hundreds of POW camps scattered through the American landscape. The gates began to open, not for punishment, but for departure. Orders had come from Washington. All prisoners are to be repatriated. For many, it was a moment they had dreamed of since the day of their capture. But as the trains prepared to roll east, an unexpected feeling crept in. Hesitation. They were finally going home. Yet none of them knew what home meant anymore. At Camp Hearn in Texas, the loudspeakers crackled one last time. A voice called out names in perfect German, each syllable echoing across the parade ground. Prisoners packed their meager belongings, a few letters, a hand-carved chess set, perhaps a harmonica. Some carried books they had read during captivity. Steinbeck, Emerson, Whitman, words that had changed the way they saw the world. The American guards, many of them scarcely older than the prisoners, came to shake hands. Good luck, they said. Take care of yourselves. No hatred remained, only respect, the kind born from time, routine, and shared humanity. One prisoner offered his guard a small wooden carving of an eagle. Keep it, he said. From a soldier to a soldier, the guard nodded, his voice quiet. Just make sure your next one has no swastika. They both smiled. The barbed wire gates opened. For the first time in years, the men walked out freely, yet not as victors or vanquished, but as witnesses to history. The trains rattled through the American plains, then across the Atlantic where Liberty ships awaited. The journey home would take weeks, long, cold weeks filled with memories and questions. At night, the men gathered on deck, staring at the horizon. The sea was endless, the wind sharp. They spoke softly about what awaited them: ruins, ration cards, hunger, and the haunting silence of cities that no longer existed. Some had learned their hometowns were gone entirely. Others had heard rumors of occupation zones, of Soviet troops in the east, of families displaced or lost. Still, amid the uncertainty, there was something else, a fragile hope. They were no longer the same men who had marched into battle years before. America had changed them. The discipline remained, but the ideology was gone. In its place was something quieter, sturdier, a belief that dignity came not from flags, but from freedom. When the ships finally reached Europe, the contrast was staggering. They had left behind the abundance of America, green fields, warm meals, safety. Now they stepped into a land of smoke and silence. Hamburg, Bremen, Kiel, cities reduced to skeletons of stone. Railways twisted, bridges collapsed, the air still heavy with the scent of charred wood and dust. Families met the returning prisoners with tears, disbelief, and sometimes anger. Where were you? They asked. In America, the men replied, but it wasn't America the conqueror they spoke of. It was America the idea. They told stories of fairness, of guards who treated them as equals, of classrooms and films, of books that spoke of liberty and conscience. They described how even in captivity, they had seen a kind of justice their own nation had abandoned. These conversations, whispered in ruined kitchens and crowded shelters, became the first seeds of transformation. Historians would later call them the silent Democrats, the former POWs who returned from America with a changed heart. They were not political leaders or intellectuals. They were ordinary men, farmers, mechanics, engineers, teachers. But their influence was profound. In the British and American zones of occupied Germany, many took part in rebuilding local governments. They voted, they taught, they rebuilt schools and unions, bringing with them lessons learned behind barbed wire. One former POW from Alabama's Camp Aliceville became a school principal in Bavaria. He introduced a student council, explaining everyone should have a voice, even the youngest. Another, who had once been a Luftwaffe radio operator, joined a Democratic newspaper, printing editorials that read, "Freedom is responsibility." not chaos. They did not preach, they practiced. Their captivity had become their classroom. Back in the United States, many guards and former prisoners continued to write to one another. Letters crossed the Atlantic filled with photographs, updates, and gratitude. A sergeant from Nebraska received a note in careful English: "When I rebuild my house, I will hang your photograph in it. You were my first teacher of democracy." Some Americans even visited Germany years later, reuniting with the men they had once guarded. What began in war had ended in friendship, and across the ruins of Europe, that quiet bond between former enemies became a small but powerful symbol of what peace could look like. When historians speak of Germany's post-war miracle, they often mention the Marshall Plan, industrial recovery, or American policy. But few speak of the human foundation laid years earlier. In the hearts of those POWs who returned home transformed, they had seen a different kind of power, not one enforced by fear, but earned through fairness. They carried that understanding into the rebuilding of their nation. And so, in a paradox of history, captivity became the seed of liberation. The war had tried to destroy them. Instead, it taught them what it truly meant to be free. As one former prisoner wrote in 1948, "We went to America as soldiers of the Reich. We returned as citizens of the world. The fences had fallen. The war was over. But the memory of the strange, improbable humanity born behind barbed wire would live forever." The years that followed turned the memories of those camps into whispers, fragments of stories shared in quiet rooms, in letters, or over a glass of wine between former enemies turned friends. Across America, the barracks were torn down, the open fields reclaimed by grass and silence. Where guards once stood with rifles, children now played. The fences rusted, the watchtowers collapsed, and the land remembered peace. For the Germans who had lived behind that wire, the experience became something sacred, almost private. They had gone to war believing in supremacy, in obedience, in power. They returned with an understanding that freedom was not an American invention, it was a human birthright, and somewhere between the labor fields of Texas and the shipyards of Louisiana, they'd seen a version of their enemy that was not made of hatred or propaganda, but of simple humanity. That memory, quiet, unassuming, would become part of Germany's rebirth. When the Marshall Plan poured life into Europe, these men were ready. They understood discipline and structure, but now they also understood compassion and cooperation. They helped lay the foundations of a democracy that, in time, would stand as one of the strongest in the modern world. Historians rarely linger on their stories. Their names don't appear in textbooks, but their transformation, the unseen education, that occurred behind American fences, changed the course of a nation. The true irony of war is that it sometimes teaches peace more powerfully than peace itself. As the camera fades to black, we imagine one of those former prisoners, older now, standing in a field somewhere in Bavaria. The sun is setting. The horizon glows gold. He closes his eyes and remembers a distant sound, the whistle of a train leaving an American camp. Carrying him home, he smiles faintly and whispers to no one, "They treated us like men." The wind carries the words away. The fences are gone, but what they learned inside them remains forever.